Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
On the night of May 14, 2013, in a quiet farming town outside of El Reno, Oklahoma, the sky turned black before sunset. Clint Mercer, a storm chaser with 5 years of experience, had seen his share of tornadoes. But that day, something felt off. The humidity clung unnaturally thick in the air, and the winds didn't behave right. They circled and shifted like they were alive, like they were searching for something. Clint and his partner Rachel had been tracking the supercell for hours, watching it evolve on radar. But when it dropped its first funnel, something changed. The wind didn't roar, it screamed. They followed at a distance, expecting the usual: damage, chaos, maybe a glimpse of the tornado's full shape through rain curtains. But this one was different. It moved erratically, widening and narrowing, like it was breathing. It wasn't touching down in a straight line. It zigzagged through the fields as if chasing shadows. At 7:03 p.m., it hit the small community of Drexel, a place with a gas station, a few churches, and a scattering of homes. People had taken shelter, but not all of them. Cell service was patchy. Tornado sirens had failed to trigger. Clint and Rachel pulled up on a rise above town, and from their position they saw it. An EF5 wedge tornado, wider than any Clint had seen, nearly 3 miles across, moving with impossible speed. But the terrifying part wasn't the size. It was what Clint saw inside it. As lightning strobed across the sky, he swore he saw forms, figures flashing in the core of the tornado. Not debris, not cars or trees or roof shingles. Human shapes. Faces twisted in silent screams, arms outstretched. Rachel saw it too. They said nothing for a moment, watching as the tornado swallowed Drexel whole. A church steeple vanished like a candle snuffed out. Then, like a curtain drawing closed, the funnel turned gray again, and the figures disappeared. They drove into town the moment it passed. What they found didn't make sense. Several houses were gone, ripped off their foundations, but others were untouched, pristine, as if the tornado had skipped over them on purpose. In one destroyed home, they found a storm cellar open and empty, but there was no sign of the family who lived there. No blood, no bodies, no clothing or personal items. Just a spiral burn mark around the edges of the cellar, as though it had been seared. Down the road, they found a man sitting on a swing set in what used to be his backyard. His house was reduced to splinters, but he sat there, swinging slowly, staring into nothing. He didn't react when they approached. Clint knelt in front of him, trying to get his attention. The man blinked slowly and said, "It whispered to me." Clint asked, "What did?" "The storm," he replied. "It said my name, over and over, like it knew me. It said if I didn't go outside, it would take my wife." Clint stood in stunned silence. Rachel walked toward the remnants of the house and came back pale. "There's no wife," she said. "There's no pictures of anyone else, no clothes. It's like no one else ever lived there." Over the next 2 days, search and rescue teams combed through what was left of Drexel. They found no survivors. They also found no bodies. 15 homes were destroyed, but no one could confirm how many people had lived in them. Some had records, some didn't. Neighbors remembered families that no longer appeared in public record. The official report listed the death toll at unknown. Some chalked it up to lost data, missing persons, displaced survivors. But storm chasers talked in hushed tones after that, about the El Reno phantom tornado, about the shapes inside it, about the places it touched where nothing and no one was left behind. Clint retired from chasing storms after that. Rachel moved to Arizona and never looked back. But sometimes, on quiet summer nights when the wind picks up and thunder rolls across the flatlands, Clint swears he hears it, his name, whispered low and hollow, like breath across a cracked window. And every spring, without fail, a small twister touches down near where Drexel once stood. There is no town there now, just empty fields. But the locals say when the clouds gather and the sirens fail and the air gets too still to breathe, you can see them again, those shapes in the wind, and if you listen closely, they whisper your name too.
Story number 2.
It was the night of May 3rd, 1999, in a quiet rural stretch outside Mulhall, Oklahoma, when the sky turned the color of old bruises and the wind died so suddenly it felt like the earth had stopped breathing. Amy Rader was 16, babysitting her 2 younger cousins at their grandmother's farmhouse, while the adults were out for a church meeting. The house was the kind people drove past without noticing. Modest, chipped paint, a wraparound porch sagging slightly, but it had been there for 3 generations, never once moved or touched by a storm. That night, Amy stood on the back porch watching the horizon, crickets silenced, leaves unmoving, when she noticed the faintest hum, a low vibration in the soles of her feet, like something massive shifting underground. At first, the TV flickered with static, and then came the emergency alert. She ran inside just as the weatherman's voice cracked with urgency. A large and extremely dangerous tornado is heading directly toward Logan County. Seek shelter now. This is not a drill. Amy bolted to the cellar door in the hallway and yanked it open, yelling for the kids. But as she tried to herd them downstairs, the older of the two, Ben, pointed to the window and whispered, "It's coming." She turned and froze. There in the distance, the sky had torn itself open. A massive wedge tornado churned across the fields like a god's fist dragging the earth, wider than anything she'd ever seen on the news. The funnel itself was nearly silent, but the debris cloud, filled with steel, dirt, and trees, screamed. It swallowed barns, telephone poles, and cattle, lifting entire lives of the sky and grinding them into nothing. Amy pulled the kids down into the storm cellar and slammed the door shut. It was dark, damp, with only one flickering battery lantern and the sound of their panicked breathing. And then they felt it, deep groaning from the earth itself, followed by the high-pitched shriek of nails being torn from wood. The tornado was directly over them. Upstairs, the house was being ripped apart. The wind found every crack, pried every board, screamed through every crevice. The cellar door rattled violently, dust fell from the ceiling, and then came the most horrifying sound Amy had ever heard. The sound of the entire house being pulled from its foundation. And then silence. Not wind, not rain, not thunder, nothing. She reached out and touched the lantern. It was still flickering. One of the kids whimpered, and Amy reached for them in the dark. Then the scratching started. It was faint at first, just a brush like fingernails along stone. Then it grew louder, more insistent. Something was scraping against the outer cellar walls. The wind was gone. The tornado had passed, but something else was still outside. Amy sat frozen, pressing the kids close. The scratching circled the cellar, slow and deliberate. Then came a soft thump, and another. It was as if someone or something was testing the door. She waited, not breathing, as the minutes dragged on like hours. Finally, she summoned the courage to slowly, quietly push the door open. The world above had changed. The house was gone, completely vanished. Only fragments remained scattered across the field like bones. The barn was splintered into toothpicks. The neighbor's grain silo had been wrapped around a tree like foil. But that wasn't what made Amy scream. It was the footprints. Massive, inhuman footprints, pressed deep into the soaked earth, circling the cellar. Not animal, not human, and too deliberate to be debris. 5-toed. Wide, but far too long. They led away from the cellar and disappeared into the woods. Emergency crews arrived an hour later. Amy tried to tell them about the scratching and the footprints, but they dismissed it. Shock, they said. A tornado that size does strange things to the mind. But she never forgot. Even now, Amy never leaves the cellar unlocked. And every May 3rd, no matter where she is, she swears she hears that same slow, deliberate scraping just beneath the floorboards.
Story number 3.
On May 22nd, 2019, just outside the quiet town of Elmore, Kansas, something happened that few talk about without a tremble in their voice. The official reports speak of a tornado classified as an EF4, but what happened that evening goes far beyond wind and wreckage. It was horror in a form nature rarely delivers. The Patterson family had lived on their farm for generations. The house was old, reinforced, and built to withstand storms that often rolled across the plains. That day it started like any other. Muggy air, heavy clouds, birds flying low. Kyle Patterson, the father, was out in the fields fixing fencing. His wife, Lydia, had been in the kitchen baking bread. And their daughter, Emily, 10 years old and curious about everything, was reading in the upstairs attic, her favorite hiding place. The tornado sirens started just after 15 p.m., but by then Kyle had already seen the funnel forming on the horizon. It was massive, thick, black, and swirling in a way he described later as writhing like it was alive. He bolted to the house, screaming for his wife and daughter, They barely made it into the storm cellar beneath the kitchen when the roar hit. Everyone says a tornado sounds like a freight train, but those who lived through the Elmore storm described something worse. There was a moaning, like hundreds of voices screaming through the wind. Lydia wept, clutching Emily to her chest as the cellar doors rattled and dust rained from the ceiling. Kyle, stoic and silent, kept his eyes on the narrow slit of light above, watching as everything dimmed. Then something thudded against the cellar door. Not debris, too deliberate. 3 knocks. Loud, slow. Kyle assumed it was a neighbor seeking shelter. Against Lydia's protests, he opened the door just a crack. The wind screamed in like a banshee, almost tearing the door from his grip. But what he saw on the other side wasn't a person. He swore he saw a man standing upright in the center of the storm, not being pulled, not even blinking. The man's eyes were entirely white, and he was smiling. The door slammed shut. Kyle screamed, backing away from it like it had burned him. Emily began to scream too, because they were no longer alone in the cellar. It started with a smell. Rot, wet soil, like something had been unearthed. Then came the cold. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Kyle could see his breath, and Lydia began to shake uncontrollably. In the dim lantern light, they saw movement in the back corner of the cellar where shelves of old canned goods lined the wall. A shape, crouched, hunched low, breathing. Kyle raised the lantern. There was a man there, but not one of flesh and blood. His skin looked like it had been scraped off by wind. Torn clothes hung from skeletal limbs, and when he turned his head, it cracked like old wood. His mouth opened, but instead of a voice, there was a howling wind that burst from within him, extinguishing the lantern. In the pitch black, the cellar erupted in screams. Emily was pulled from Lydia's arms, dragged toward the far end of the room. Kyle tackled into the dark, swinging fists at nothing. Lydia lit a match, briefly revealing dozens of muddy handprints smeared across the walls. Some were small, like a child's. The wind suddenly stopped. Silence fell. When the cellar doors creaked open, daylight poured in. The storm had passed. But Emily was gone. The town was in ruins, houses leveled, trees stripped. In the weeks that followed, rescue teams searched the rubble. No sign of Emily was ever found. No blood, no body. Just a trail of small, muddy footprints that led away from the house into a nearby cornfield, where they simply stopped. Kyle and Lydia moved away not long after. They don't talk about that day to reporters. But Kyle, when drunk, once told a local gas station attendant that the man in the storm still visits him in his dreams. He says he hears Emily's voice calling from the wind. And every year on May 22nd, around the same time the tornado struck, strong winds rolled through Elmore, even on calm, cloudless days. And if you listen closely, above the gusts, some say you can hear a little girl crying or laughing.